When I heard my wife cheerfully telling her daughter about with her boss and that she was laughing at me, I decided to take revenge on her. Her life step by step. I never thought I'd be the kind of guy to find myself in this situation. Retired, with a second wife much younger than me, and all that baggage they never tell you about. My name's Richard Rick Morrison. I'm 52, a retired Navy officer who served for over 2 decades. I'm used to structure, respect, and most of all, loyalty. But this was a whole new level of betrayal that I never saw coming. Let me back up for a second. I live in a place called Highland Hills, just outside Denver, Colorado. It's one of those upscale suburban neighborhoods where the lawns are manicured, the fences are white, and the houses are big. Our house, is a large colonial-style home with a big yard and a 2-car garage where I spend most of my time tinkering with my 1970 Dodge Charger. That car is my pride and joy, my old buddy. It's been with me through thick and thin, and working on it keeps me sane, especially now. My wife, Emily, is 33. I met her after I retired. She's beautiful, no denying that. Long blonde hair, big blue eyes, the kind of woman who turns heads wherever she goes. At first, everything was perfect. We had this chemistry that just clicked. But over the past year or so, something changed. I'm not stupid. I noticed the shift, the distance. I just didn't want to believe it. Em's daughter, Grace, lives with us. She's 20 and in college, working part-time while trying to figure out her future. Grace is a good kid, quiet, keeps to herself mostly, but I know she's got that rebellious streak like most young adults. They're close, Em and Grace. Almost too close sometimes, like they're more friends than mother and daughter. Maybe that's just how things are now. I don't know. It's different from how I grew up. Anyway, last Saturday, something happened that changed everything for me. I remember it clearly because it was one of those rare fall evenings when I had the house to myself. Emily and Grace had gone to some corporate party for Emily's work, private, invitation-only kind of thing. It was held at this fancy restaurant downtown, the Ivy Room. I knew the place. Upscale, expensive. Only about 50 or so people were invited, all employees of the company and their plus ones. Em had been talking about it for weeks. It was supposed to be a big deal, with their CEO, a guy named John Mercer, hosting it. Mercer's in his late 40s, tall, smooth, with that arrogant CEO vibe. Emily hadn't invited me to the party. She said it was work-related and that I wouldn't enjoy it. I didn't push back. I had my Charger to work on, so I was content spending the evening in the garage, a beer in hand, greasy rag over my shoulder, listening to classic rock while tuning up the engine. Around midnight, they came home. I didn't think much of it at first. Emily had been drinking. That much was clear from the way she stumbled into the house with Grace following behind. They went straight to the kitchen, laughing loudly about something. I was still in the garage, wiping my hands, when I heard them through the open window. It was Emily's voice that stopped me cold. Something about the tone, the way she was talking, sent a chill down my spine. Grace, you should have seen him. Oh my God. I was so drunk. Emily laughed. Her voice slurred. I can't believe I did that with Mercer. Mercer? I froze, barely breathing, and leaned closer to the window. Grace snickered. Did what, Mom? You know. Emily's voice dropped into a mocking whisper. I had sex with him. I felt the rag slip from my hands as my heart pounded in my chest. She couldn't be serious. I stood there, frozen in the garage, listening as the woman I had married, the woman I trusted, went on, oblivious to the fact that I was just a few feet away. It was wild, she continued, laughing again. I couldn't help myself. John's just got that way about him, you know? And then, you won't believe this, I hooked up with Brad too. Right there in the bathroom. Brad? Grace asked, shocked but amused. Yeah, Brad Sanders, the one from accounting. The guy's got a body on him. I'll give him that. Mercer left the room for a minute, and Brad just, slid in. My stomach turned, and I felt bile rising in my throat. How could she do this? And she was bragging about it to her own daughter like it was some kind of joke. My hand instinctively went to my phone in my pocket. Without thinking, I hit record. I don't get it, Mom, Grace said. What about Rick? Oh, please, Emily scoffed, her voice filled with contempt. Rick's a good guy, sure, but he's so boring. He doesn't know anything about what I need, especially in bed. He's an old sucker, and honestly, I don't even think he'd care. He's clueless. He's more in love with that damn car of his than me anyway. I stood there in the dark, my hands trembling as I recorded every word. I wanted to storm into the house, confront her, throw her out. But something stopped me. Instead, I saved the recording and slipped my phone back into my pocket. Confronting her would be too easy, too predictable. She already thought I was some kind of fool. No, I wasn't going to do that. I was going to make her regret this, but I needed time to think. I spent the rest of the night in the garage, pretending like everything was normal. The next morning, Emily was her usual self, bright, cheerful, like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked me what I wanted for breakfast. I played along, keeping my face neutral, but inside, I was seething. Every time she smiled at me, I saw her with Mercer and Brad, laughing behind my back. Over the next few days, I started to plan. Revenge wasn't just something you jumped into. It had to be precise, controlled. I'd learned that in the Navy. A hasty move could get you killed. I needed to bide my time, gather information. I knew Emily's schedule, her friends, where she went and who she talked to. I started paying closer attention to her, making notes. I even started following her sometimes without her knowing. It was easy enough. She never suspected a thing. She thought I was too wrapped up in my charger or too old to care. In the meantime, I kept listening to that recording over and over again, each time feeling a fresh wave of anger. But I didn't let it consume me. I channeled it. I was going to make her pay. I just didn't know how yet. One evening, a week later, she mentioned another company event coming up, another private party, this time a weekend retreat at a cabin in Aspen. The same crowd would be there, Mercer, Brad, and the rest of her colleagues. It was supposed to be an employee bonding event, just like the last one. She didn't even bother asking me to come. This time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I'd decided. This would be my moment. This was where I'd make my move. I smiled at her, pretending like everything was fine. Inside, I was already 10 steps ahead. It took me a few days to figure out what my next step would be. This wasn't just about catching Emily in the act or confronting her with the evidence I had. I wanted something more, something that would leave her with nothing. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted to dismantle her life, piece by piece, the same way she had destroyed my trust. I couldn't do this alone, though. I needed someone who knew how to play this game, someone who understood how to navigate the world Emily and her boss, John Mercer, lived in. That's when I remembered Dan. Dan Whitaker wasn't just any old friend. He was a real player in the business world. He was a close friend of an old Navy buddy of mine, Mike Lawson, who'd introduced us years back. Dan was a wealthy investor, connected to all the right people, CEOs, politicians, the kind of men who could ruin you with a phone call. I had no doubt Dan would be able to help me with this. We met up at his usual spot, a private cigar lounge called the Granite Room, tucked away on a quiet street in downtown Denver. It was the kind of place where deals were made over whiskey and cigars, where power moved in silence. I arrived early and sat at a corner table, nursing a glass of bourbon, waiting for Dan to show up. He walked in about 15 minutes later, dressed in his usual tailored suit, looking every bit the part of a man who knew exactly how much power he had. Dan was in his early 50s, sharp, with a well-kept beard and a calm demeanor that masked how ruthless he could be when he needed to be. "Rick, long time no see," he said, sliding into the leather seat across from me. He ordered a whiskey, neat, and then leaned back, studying me with those piercing eyes of his. "You sounded serious on the phone. What's going on?" I took a deep breath and laid it all out for him. Everything I'd heard, everything I'd recorded. I told him about Emily's affair with her boss and the accountant, Brad Sanders. How she mocked me, called me an old sucker behind my back. I played him the recording on my phone. Dan listened in silence, his expression never changing. But I knew him well enough to know that his mind was already working. When it finished, he set his glass down and looked me square in the eye. "You want to ruin her," he said, more of a statement than a question. I nodded. "And her boss. And the other guy. I don't just want her to feel embarrassed. I want to destroy their lives." Dan considered this for a moment, then took a slow sip of his whiskey. "All right," he said, finally. "First, we need more leverage. That recording is good, but it's not enough. We need visuals, something undeniable. You've got cameras in the house?" "Not yet," I admitted. "Then that's step one. Install cameras. Catch her on tape. If she's as careless as you say, it won't take long for her to slip up again. Once we've got that, we'll plan the next move." I nodded, taking it all in. Dan's calm, methodical approach was exactly what I needed. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was too close to this. But Dan, he saw it as just another problem to solve. We spent the next hour going over the details. He suggested I install the cameras in the living room and kitchen, where Emily and Grace usually hung out. Places where they wouldn't think twice about having personal conversations. "Make sure they're hidden well," he advised. "The last thing we need is her finding them. You can get the equipment online. Easy enough. Get motion-activated ones, so you're not recording hours of nothing." We talked through the rest of the plan while we finished our drinks. The granite room was quiet, the soft murmur of other patrons filling the background. We sat in the dim light, surrounded by the faint scent of cigars, and went over every possible scenario, every potential problem. "Once you've got the footage," Dan said, leaning forward, "we'll use it to ruin them. Not just publicly, but personally. We'll send it to Mercer's wife first, then to Brad's. Their reputations will take a hit in their personal lives. But that's just the beginning. We'll leak the video to their company, destroy their professional lives as well. And as for Emily, we'll make sure she has nowhere to go when it all comes crashing down." I agreed, feeling a sense of purpose, like this was the only way forward. Dan finished his drink and stood up, clapping me on the shoulder. "Call me when you've got the footage. We'll go from there." That night, I got to work. I bought the cameras online, just like Dan had suggested. They arrived 2 days later, small and easy to hide. I installed them in the living room, the kitchen, and even one in the hallway leading to our bedroom. Emily wouldn't suspect a thing. She was always so caught up in her own world that she barely noticed what I was doing most of the time anyway. It didn't take long for the cameras to start paying off. Just a few days later, I got the footage I needed. Emily and Grace were in the living room, sitting on the couch, sipping wine and laughing about something when the conversation turned to the party again. "Have I shown you the picture yet?" Emily asked, pulling out her phone. Grace looked intrigued. "What picture?" "From last Saturday, with Mercer." I felt my blood boil as I watched from the camera feed. Emily unlocked her phone and showed Grace the screen. Even from the small angle the camera caught, I could see the photo, her and John Mercer, both of them naked, tangled together in a bed I didn't recognize. They were laughing, their bodies pressed together. Emily held the phone up proudly, like it was some kind of trophy. "Oh my God, Mom." Grace laughed, but she didn't seem shocked or upset. She seemed impressed. "You two look so wild. I can't believe you hooked up with him." "I know," Emily giggled, taking another sip of her wine. "And Brad, too." Mercer was in the bathroom when Brad came in. It was so quick, but God, it was hot. Grace shook her head, clearly amused. "What about Rick?" "Rick?" Emily scoffed. "He's clueless. He wouldn't even know what to do if he walked in on me. He's too busy with that car of his." "I'm telling you, Gracie, you can do whatever you want as long as you play your cards right." I had everything I needed. The footage was clear, the audio perfect. She had exposed herself in every possible way, and this time, I wasn't just going to let it slide. I called Dan that evening, told him I had the footage. "Good," he said. "We'll meet tomorrow, same place." The next day, we met again at the Granite Room. I brought the footage with me on a USB drive, and we watched it together in silence, Dan's expression unreadable as the video played out. When it was over, he leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "This is perfect," he said. "Now we move on to phase 2. We spent the next 2 hours planning every detail. Dan's plan was simple but devastating. First, we'd send the footage to John Mercer's wife, Catherine. She was the kind of woman who wouldn't take something like this lightly. She had a reputation to uphold, and the last thing she'd want is for this kind of scandal to go public. She'd make sure Mercer felt the consequences. Next, we'd leak the video to the HR department at Emily's company. They had a strict no fraternization policy, and Mercer and Brad would both be fired on the spot. Emily would be left jobless and humiliated. But we weren't done yet. We'd send the footage to Brad's wife, Amanda, as well. She'd be just as furious as Catherine, and once the dust settled, neither of those men would have anything left. As for Emily, once she lost her job and her reputation, I'd make sure she couldn't rely on me for anything. She'd lose the house, the car, everything. I would file for divorce and take her for everything she had. I'd already started speaking to a lawyer about the best way to do it, quietly building my case while she was busy living her double life. It was all falling into place. I felt a strange sense of calm as Dan and I finalized the plan. This wasn't about rage anymore. It was about precision. Emily had made her choices, and now she was going to face the consequences. After that meeting with Dan, the plan was set in motion. We weren't just sitting back, waiting for everything to fall apart. No, we were actively dismantling their lives. Dan had a saying he liked to repeat: patience is power. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This wasn't about rushing to confront Emily or taking down her boss. It was about getting every last piece of information, creating a storm so perfectly timed that by the time it hit, there would be no escape for any of them. I decided to take things a step further. While Dan was connected, I knew I'd need professional eyes on the ground, people who specialized in tracking and gathering information. I hired a private investigator named Greg Callahan. Greg was ex-police, in his late 40s, sharp as a tack, and had the kind of experience I needed to get deep into the lives of Emily, Mercer, and Brad Sanders without drawing attention. He operated out of an office in Englewood, just south of Denver. I met him there to explain everything. Greg leaned back in his creaky office chair, stroking his unshaven chin as I laid out the situation. "So, you're looking to keep tabs on all three of them?" he asked, scratching down notes on a yellow legal pad. His office smelled of old coffee and stale cigarettes, but his reputation was solid. I knew he'd get the job done. "Yeah, I need to know where they go, who they meet, any more dirt you can dig up. I've already got footage of Emily, but I need more. I need to know everything Mercer and Sanders are up to when they think no one's watching." Greg nodded, his eyes narrowing in focus. "All right, I'll start following them. I've got a couple of guys I can bring in on this, too. We'll start with Mercer and work our way down." "Good," I said, handing him a small envelope. Inside was enough cash to cover the first 2 weeks. "Let me know the second you find anything." Over the next week, Greg's reports started rolling in. He had 2 detectives following Mercer, 1 following Brad, and he personally kept an eye on Emily whenever she was out. Mercer was the key to all of this. He was the CEO, the one with the most to lose. And what we uncovered about him was far more than I had expected. First, Greg found out that Mercer was living a double life. While he had his high-profile image as the polished CEO of a multimillion-dollar tech firm, he was also hiding a secret relationship. It turned out he had a mistress, a woman named Jessica, in her early 30s, who worked in marketing for another company downtown. She had no idea about Mercer's wife, Catherine, or about Emily, for that matter. Greg's team managed to get photos of them meeting up at hotels, sneaking out of restaurants, and taking weekend trips to Aspen under the guise of business meetings. But that wasn't the worst of it. Greg dug deeper, uncovering some shady financial dealings. Mercer had been moving large sums of money between accounts, transfers that didn't make sense for someone with his level of wealth. Greg flagged it as suspicious, suspecting either tax evasion or some kind of under-the-table payment. Whatever it wasn't legal, and it gave us even more leverage over him. As for Brad Sanders, the accountant who thought he could just slip in behind Mercer's back, he wasn't exactly clean either. Greg's team caught him meeting with a younger woman who wasn't his wife, Amanda, in a hotel near the airport. More cheating, more lies. It was almost too easy. Meanwhile, Emily was oblivious to all of this. She was still going about her daily routine, spending her evenings with Grace or going to work events. She didn't suspect a thing, didn't even notice the subtle changes in my behavior. I didn't confront her, didn't ask about where she was going or who she was seeing. I played the part of the clueless husband perfectly, just as she expected. She thought she had everything under control, but in reality, I was the one pulling the strings. Dan and I met regularly to discuss the next steps. We'd sit in his study, a dark, wood-paneled room in his mansion on the outskirts of Denver. The place looked like something out of an old crime drama. Dim lighting, leather armchairs, and shelves lined with books that no one ever read. We'd sip whiskey while we went over Greg's latest findings. "This is getting better by the day," Dan said one evening, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Mercer's financials are a ticking time bomb. If we can leak that to the right people, he's done for. As for Brad, well, that guy's just an idiot. He won't be hard to take down." "What about Emily?" I asked, setting my glass down on the table between us. "She's the one I really want to hurt." Dan leaned back, thinking. "We've got enough on her already, but we need to time it right. If we hit her too soon, she'll try to weasel her way out. We need to make sure there's nowhere for her to run. Once Mercer and Sanders fall, she'll have no one left to rely on. That's when we strike." He was right. As much as I wanted to see her crumble right then and there, I knew this had to be methodical. The longer we waited, the more devastating the impact would be. A few days later, Greg came through with even more dirt on Mercer. Apparently, he had a habit of making shady deals with some less than reputable businessmen. One of them was a contractor who had ties to organized crime. Nothing too serious, but enough to raise eyebrows if the information ever got out. Greg managed to get photos of them meeting in a parking garage late at night, exchanging what looked like an envelope full of cash. It was exactly the kind of scandal that could sink Mercer's career. We decided to take action. I sent the photos of Mercer with his mistress to his wife, Catherine. I didn't include a return address or any kind of explanation, just the photos. I wanted her to come to her own conclusions. I knew that once she saw them, she'd confront him, and that would be the beginning of his unraveling. It didn't take long. 2 days later, Greg called me with the news. "Catherine filed for divorce this morning," he said over the phone. Apparently, she kicked him out of the house. Word's starting to spread at his company, too. It's only a matter of time before the board finds out. I smiled to myself. That was the first domino to fall. Mercer was on his way down, and there was no stopping it now. But we weren't done. Dan and I still had work to do. We needed to make sure Mercer's financial dealings went public, that the right people got wind of his shady business practices. Dan made a few calls to some contacts in the media, people he knew who could leak the story without it tracing back to us. Within a week, an anonymous report about Mercer's offshore accounts and illegal transfers was making the rounds in business circles. It was only a matter of time before the authorities got involved. Meanwhile, Greg continued to follow Brad. He was still meeting with his mistress, still living in his little bubble of lies. We decided it was time to take him down, too. I sent the photos of him and his mistress to his wife, Amanda, just like we had with Mercer's wife. Amanda didn't waste any time. She filed for divorce the same day she got the photos. With Mercer and Brad both facing personal and professional ruin, I turned my focus back to Emily. By now, she had started to notice that something was off. She'd come home from work, looking distracted, as if she knew things were falling apart but couldn't figure out why. She'd ask me questions, casual, but probing. "Have you heard anything about Mercer?" she asked one evening, sitting across from me at the dinner table. Her voice was tense, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. "No," I lied, taking a bite of my steak. "Why? What's going on?" "I don't know," she said, fidgeting with her fork. "There's just rumors going around the office. Something about his wife filing for divorce. And I heard HR might be looking into some things." "Sounds serious," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You think he's in trouble?" She shrugged, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She was starting to realize that her little world wasn't as secure as she thought. A week later, everything came crashing down for her. Dan had sent the footage of Emily with Mercer and Brad to her boss at the company. It was an anonymous tip, of course. No one could trace it back to me. The HR department moved quickly, launching an investigation. Emily was called into a meeting, and when she came home that evening, her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. "They know," she whispered, sitting down at the kitchen table. "HR knows about me and Mercer. They know about Brad. I'm going to lose my job, Rick. I don't know what to do." I sat across from her, watching as she unraveled right before my eyes. She had no idea that I had been behind all of it, that I had orchestrated every step of her downfall. She was on the verge of tears, looking at me like I was her only hope. "It'll be okay," I lied, placing a hand on hers. "We'll figure it out." But in reality, I was already planning my next move. The house was in my name, the car was mine, and I had enough evidence to guarantee I'd get full custody of everything in the divorce. Emily had nothing left. Over the next few days, her situation only got worse. She was fired from her job, and word spread quickly among her colleagues. No one wanted to be associated with her, not after the scandal broke. Mercer had been forced to resign, and Brad's reputation was in shambles. They were all falling apart, and I was there to watch every second of it. Emily tried to hold on, but it was no use. She was drowning, and there was nothing she could do to save herself. The months that followed felt like watching a slow-motion car wreck. Emily's life spiraled further out of control with every passing day, and the tension in the house was thick enough to cut through. She was no longer the confident, vibrant woman I had once married. Now, she was a shadow of herself, constantly anxious, always looking over her shoulder, as if she could sense that something worse was coming but had no idea when or where the next blow would land. It wasn't just her professional life that was crumbling. Her relationship with Grace had started to deteriorate in ways neither of them saw coming. At first, Grace was the one person Emily could turn to, the one who listened and supported her, even when the walls were closing in. But after everything that happened at the company, after Grace learned the full extent of her mother's actions, something shifted between them. Grace wasn't a little girl anymore, and she wasn't blind to the chaos around her. She was smart, and it didn't take long for her to start connecting the dots. I remember one evening, late October, when Grace came to me in the garage. I was working on the charger, tightening some bolts, trying to keep my hands busy as my mind churned over the next phase of the plan. Grace leaned against the door frame, her arms crossed, watching me in silence for a moment before she finally spoke. "Rick," she started hesitantly, her voice quiet. "What's really going on with Mom?" I wiped my hands on a rag and turned to face her, keeping my expression calm. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she sighed, looking down at her feet. "Why is everything falling apart? She's lost her job, Mercer's out, and now her friends won't even return her calls. It's like everything is crashing down, and she won't tell me why." I paused, thinking carefully about how to answer. Grace was smart, but I didn't want to push her too far, too fast. She wasn't like her mother. She didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of this mess. "Your mom made some bad decisions," I said finally, choosing my words carefully. "I'm not sure she really understands how much damage those decisions caused. But it's not your fault, Grace. You have to know that." She looked at me, her eyes wide and filled with uncertainty. "What should I do?" I shrugged, turning back to the charger, giving her the space to think. "That's up to you. But don't let her drag you down with her. You've got your own life to live." That seemed to hit her hard. She was quiet for a long time after that, just standing there, lost in thought. Then she finally nodded, muttering a quick thanks before heading back inside. That was the turning point for her. Over the next few weeks, I noticed the distance growing between Grace and Emily. Grace started spending more time out of the house, away from the tension and stress. She made excuses to avoid dinners, stayed in her room more often, and when she did interact with her mother, it was short, clipped conversations that barely passed for communication. Emily noticed the change, of course. She tried to reach out, to rekindle the connection they once had, but Grace wasn't having it. I'd watch from the sidelines as Emily's attempts to mend things were met with cold indifference. It was like Grace had finally realized just how toxic her mother's influence had been, and now, she was doing everything she could to distance herself from it. Meanwhile, Mercer's situation continued to unravel. Dan and I had made sure the right people had seen the information about his financial fraud, and it wasn't long before the authorities opened a formal investigation. His business partners, those smug, wealthy men who had once flocked to his side, began pulling away as the scandal spread. No one wanted to be associated with a man under federal investigation. Deals fell through, contracts were canceled, and rumors about impending charges started to circulate. Greg Callahan, my private investigator, kept me updated on every new development. The reports from his team showed that Mercer was struggling to keep his business afloat. His company had been hit with audits, and several key clients had already walked away. It was only a matter of time before the entire operation collapsed. And through it all, Mercer remained oblivious to the fact that Dan and I were the ones pulling the strings. He was too busy scrambling to save what little he had left. Then, there was Emily. As the year went on, it became clear that she was desperately trying to regain control over her life. The problem was, she had no idea where to start. She applied for jobs, but with the scandal surrounding her departure from the company, no one wanted to hire her. Even those old friends of hers, the ones who used to call her up for drinks or invite her to dinner parties, had all but disappeared. The moment the news about Mercer's affair broke, they turned their backs on her, unwilling to associate with someone whose reputation had been dragged through the mud. I watched as she tried to salvage what little she could. She spent hours on the phone, leaving voicemails for people who never called her back. She sent out resumes, sat through interviews that led nowhere, and all the while, her confidence eroded bit by bit. Every rejection, every unanswered call, was another blow to her fragile sense of control. But the real breaking point came one afternoon in mid-November. Emily had spent the morning locked in her office, trying to secure a job with a mid-level marketing firm downtown. She'd come out of the office around lunchtime, looking pale and shaken, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. I was in the kitchen, pretending to read the paper, but I could hear every word of the conversation. They said no, she muttered into the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what else to do, Jessica. No one will hire me. It's like I've been blacklisted or something. There was a pause as she listened to the response on the other end of the line. I could only assume she was talking to Jessica, her old friend from the company, one of the few who still took her calls. Of course, I've tried everyone, she said, her voice rising slightly in frustration. I even reached out to John. No, he won't answer either. Another pause, and then a deep sigh. I'm scared, Jess. I'm really scared. Grace won't talk to me. Rick's, well, he's Rick, and now I'm going to lose the house. She stopped mid-sentence, her voice cracking. I don't know what to do. She hung up a few minutes later and just stood there in the kitchen, staring down at her phone like it held the answers to all of her problems. But it didn't. Nothing did. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that her life was slipping through her fingers and there was no one left to catch her. That night, she tried to talk to me. She sat down at the kitchen table after dinner, fidgeting with her hands, her eyes red from what I assumed was hours of crying. Rick, she started, her voice trembling, I need to talk to you. I looked up from the book I'd been pretending to read, keeping my expression neutral. What's on your mind? I know things haven't been great lately, she said, her voice shaky, and I know I've made mistakes. But I need your help. I don't know what else to do. It was almost laughable, really. The woman who had cheated on me, lied to me, and mocked me behind my back, was now sitting across from me, asking for my help. She had no idea that I was the reason her life was falling apart, that I had orchestrated everything. What kind of help are you looking for? I asked, keeping my tone even. I don't know, she stammered. Maybe we could work through this together? I know I haven't been the best wife, but we've been through so much. I don't want to lose you too. She looked at me with pleading eyes, but there was no emotion behind mine. I wasn't the man she thought I was anymore, and the part of me that might have cared was long gone. I don't think that's possible, Emily, I said, closing my book and standing up. You made your choices. Now, you have to live with them. She didn't say anything as I walked out of the room, leaving her alone at the table. In the days that followed, Emily became more frantic. She tried reaching out to more friends, even going as far as showing up at their homes unannounced, only to be turned away at the door. She'd spend hours in her office, searching for jobs online, sending out more resumes, and making more calls that went unanswered. The pressure was getting to her, and it was only a matter of time before she broke completely. Meanwhile, Dan and I continued our efforts to ensure that Mercer's fall from grace was absolute. The investigation into his financial fraud had escalated, with federal agents getting involved. His assets were frozen, his accounts under scrutiny, and several of his business partners were being questioned as part of the inquiry. The scandal had become public knowledge by now, with news outlets covering the story, and Mercer's name was being dragged through the mud in every possible way. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction watching it all play out. Mercer had thought he was untouchable, but now, his empire was crumbling, just like Emily's life. And I had a front-row seat to all of it. The psychological pressure on Emily continued to build, and by December, she was barely holding it together. She'd lost almost everything. Her job, her friends, her daughter's respect, and now, the only thing left was the house, which was hanging by a thread. I knew it wouldn't be long before she hit rock bottom, and when she did, I'd be there to make sure she stayed there. By the time winter rolled in, I'd gathered even more dirt on Emily. What started with her affair with Mercer and Brad had snowballed into something much larger. She hadn't just cheated on me with those two. There were others. Greg Callahan, my private investigator, had uncovered more during his surveillance. Emily had a history of flings with various men over the years. These weren't just office affairs. She had affairs with men I'd never even heard of, dating back to before we were married. I had Greg pull phone records, messages, everything. It was shocking how careless she had been. I found texts and photos she'd sent to an old boyfriend she'd reconnected with years ago, meeting him at hotels whenever I was away on trips. There was another man, a neighbor from our previous house in Boulder, who she'd been sneaking around with while we were still settling into our marriage. And yet another, some younger guy she'd met at a bar, who apparently had been a regular fling for months. She'd covered her tracks well enough at the time, but now, all her secrets were laid bare. I felt a cold, grim satisfaction as I pieced it all together. Every betrayal, every lie. Emily had been living a double life long before Mercer ever came into the picture. She thought she was smarter than me, thought I'd never figure it out. But she was wrong. I had the evidence now, more than enough to ruin her completely. But before I could act on it, Grace started to become suspicious. She'd been distant from Emily for weeks now, but I could sense that her focus was shifting. She was starting to notice things. How I seemed calm, almost too calm, as Emily's world crumbled around her. Grace wasn't stupid, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she confronted me. It happened one evening in early December. I was in the garage, working on the charger as usual, when Grace appeared at the doorway. She stood there, arms crossed, watching me in silence for a moment before stepping inside. "Rick, we need to talk," she said, her voice tense. I glanced up at her, wiping my hands on a rag. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated for a second, then took a deep breath. "I know something's not right. Mom's life is falling apart, and I can't shake the feeling that you're involved." I raised an eyebrow, playing dumb. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play games with me, Rick," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. Everything started to go downhill after that party. First, it was Mercer's scandal, then Mom lost her job, and now her friends won't even talk to her. It's like someone's orchestrating this, and I don't believe in coincidences, I sighed, setting the rag down on the workbench. Grace had always been sharp, and I knew this moment was coming. But I wasn't about to confess everything. Not yet. "Grace," I said, keeping my tone calm, "your mom made some bad choices. She got involved with people she shouldn't have, and now she's facing the consequences. That's all there is to it." She didn't buy it. "I don't believe you," she said flatly. "There's more to this, I know there is. I've seen the way you've been acting. You're too calm, Rick. It's like you're enjoying watching her suffer." I met her gaze, unflinching. "Do you think she doesn't deserve it? After everything she's done?" Grace flinched, her expression hardening. "That's not the point. You're supposed to be better than this. Whatever Mom did, she's still my mother. If you're behind all of this, if you're the reason her life is falling apart." I stepped closer to her, my voice low and steady. "You think your mom's innocent in all of this? She's been lying to you for years, Grace. You don't even know half of what she's done." Her eyes widened slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" I said, my voice cold. "Your mom's been cheating on me for years. Not just with Mercer. Not just with Brad. There were others. Lots of others. And she's been lying to you, too, pretending to be some victim in all of this." Grace's face went pale, her eyes darting back and forth as if she was trying to process what I just said. "That's not true. She wouldn't." "It is true," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I've got the proof. Phone records, texts, photos. She's been playing both of us, Grace. Grace stood there, stunned, as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. For a moment, she looked like she didn't know what to say, her hands trembling slightly. "You're lying," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. I walked over to the workbench and grabbed a folder I'd prepared. It was filled with everything Greg had uncovered about Emily's affairs, copies of the texts, photos, and other evidence. I handed it to Grace without a word. She hesitated for a moment before slowly opening it, her eyes scanning the contents. I watched as her expression shifted from disbelief to horror. The truth was laid out in front of her, undeniable and brutal. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with tears, but they were also filled with anger. "You knew," she said, her voice shaking. "You knew all this time, and you just let it happen?" "I didn't just let it happen," I said quietly. "I'm making sure she pays for it." Grace's eyes flashed with fury. "You're no better than she is." Before I could respond, she turned and stormed out of the garage, slamming the door behind her. I didn't follow. There was nothing more to say. She knew the truth now, and there was no going back. Over the next few days, things in the house became even more strained. Grace barely spoke to either of us, locking herself away in her room or leaving the house for hours at a time. Emily, meanwhile, was growing more desperate by the day. She'd figured out that something was wrong, that there was a connection between everything that was happening to her, and she was starting to suspect that I was involved. It all came to a head one night when Emily finally confronted me. I was in the living room, watching the news, when she stormed in, her face flushed with anger. "Rick," she said, her voice shaking with fury, "I know what you've been doing." I glanced up at her, feigning ignorance. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me," she snapped, stepping closer. "You've been behind this from the start. You and Dan. You're the reason Mercer's being investigated, the reason I lost my job. You're the one who leaked those photos, aren't you?" I didn't say anything at first, letting the silence hang in the air. Then, I slowly stood up, meeting her gaze. "And what if I am?" I said calmly. "What are you going to do about it?" Her eyes widened in shock, as if she hadn't expected me to admit it. For a moment, she just stood there, speechless, before the anger returned full force. "Why?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "Why would you do this to me?" I stepped closer to her, my voice low and controlled. "You destroyed this marriage, Emily. You lied to me. You cheated on me. And you laughed behind my back, calling me an old fool. Did you really think you could get away with it?" She stared at me, her expression a mix of fear and anger. "You had no right." "I had every right," I interrupted, my voice cold. "You're the one who ruined everything. All I did was make sure you paid the price for it." She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she just stood there, trembling, as the reality of the situation sank in. She was defeated, and she knew it. But that wasn't the end of it. There were still other battles being fought, other lives being destroyed. The investigation into Mercer's financial dealings had reached a critical point. The authorities were closing in, and his business partners were scrambling to distance themselves from the fallout. Dan had been working behind the scenes, feeding information to the right people, making sure that every detail of Mercer's fraud was brought to light. It wasn't just about ruining Mercer's career. It was about ruining his entire legacy. His company was on the verge of collapse, his assets frozen, his reputation in tatters. And soon, there would be criminal charges. There was no coming back from this. One afternoon, I got a call from Greg. "They're moving in on Mercer," he said. "The feds are going to arrest him within the week. It's all over." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a sense of finality. Mercer was finished. Brad had already been destroyed, and now, Emily's life was in ruins. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. But there was still one last thing to do. Emily had confronted me, and she knew the truth, but there was nothing she could do about it. She was too far gone, too broken to fight back. And Grace, well, Grace would come around eventually. She had to. But for now, I was content to let them both stew in their own misery. They'd made their choices, and now they were paying the price. As for me, I had no regrets. I set out to destroy the people who betrayed me, and I'm doing it. Emily, Mercer, Brad, they all thought they could make a fool of me. But in the end, I was the one who had the last laugh. By January, the final phase of my plan was ready. It was time to deliver the knockout blow to Emily's life. I had gathered everything I needed: proof of her infidelity with multiple men, financial records showing she contributed nothing to the household, and the video evidence I'd captured over the last few months. There was no way she could fight back against the divorce case I was about to hit her with. She wouldn't just lose me, she would lose everything. It was a cold Monday morning when I finally filed for divorce. I went to my lawyer, David King, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who had handled plenty of cases like mine. We sat in his downtown office, the city skyline visible through the large windows as he went over the documents one final time. "This is airtight, Rick," he said, sliding the papers across his desk for me to sign. "With the evidence you've provided, Emily doesn't stand a chance. You'll get the house, the car, everything. She won't be left with anything but her own mess." I nodded, picking up the pen and signing my name at the bottom of the page. It felt like the closing of a chapter, a long, painful chapter that had started the moment Emily had betrayed me. Now, I was finally taking control back. The divorce papers were served to Emily the following week. I didn't bother being there when she received them. I knew she'd be shocked, devastated even, but that didn't concern me. I had no more sympathy left for her. When I came home that evening, the house was quiet. Emily had locked herself in the bedroom, probably crying or making frantic phone calls to the few friends she had left. But it was too late for her to do anything. A few days later, we sat across from each other in a sterile meeting room at the lawyer's office. Emily looked like a shell of the woman she once was, her face pale, her eyes puffy and red from crying. She didn't even try to argue with the terms of the divorce. She knew she was beaten. With the evidence I had, there was no way a judge would side with her. The divorce was finalized quickly. I got the house, the car, and most of our financial assets. Emily was left with almost nothing. She didn't have a job, no real savings, and now, no place to live. She had hit rock bottom, just as I had planned. After the meeting, as I watched her walk out of the lawyer's office, her shoulders slumped and her head down, a strange sense of calm washed over me. I'd achieved my goal. My revenge was complete. Emily's life was in ruins, and I was free of her. But instead of feeling triumphant, there was a hollowness to the victory that I hadn't anticipated. I had one, yes, but the person I used to be was long gone. The man who had fallen in love with Emily all those years ago had disappeared the moment I heard her laughing about her betrayal. As for Mercer and Brad, their downfall was swift and brutal. The investigation into Mercer's financial fraud had resulted in criminal charges. He was arrested in February, his face plastered all over the news as he was led out of his mansion in handcuffs. His business partners abandoned him completely, and his once thriving company collapsed overnight. Mercer tried to deflect blame, claiming he had been set up by disgruntled employees, but the evidence was overwhelming. His career was over, and he was facing years in prison. Brad wasn't far behind. The scandal had destroyed his marriage, and he was fired from the company shortly after Mercer's arrest. He, too, tried to salvage what was left of his reputation, but it was a lost cause. His wife, Amanda, had filed for divorce, taking most of their assets, and Brad was left with nothing but the wreckage of his life. The trials were a public spectacle, with the media covering every detail of the fall from grace of two powerful men. I didn't attend the hearings. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough of their destruction, and I had no interest in witnessing their final moments in court. I had other things to deal with. While all of this was happening, Grace was quietly planning her own escape. She had distanced herself from both me and her mother over the past few months, and I could see the toll it was taking on her. She was caught between two people who had destroyed her sense of stability, and I couldn't blame her for wanting to get away from it all. One evening, just after the divorce was finalized, Grace came to me in the kitchen. She was packing a small suitcase, her face set with determination. "Rick," she said, her voice steady, "I'm leaving." I looked up from the coffee I was making. my heart sinking slightly even though I knew this moment was coming. "Where are you going?" she sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't know. I just need to get away from here. From all of this." I nodded, understanding. "You don't have to explain, Grace. I get it." She gave me a small, sad smile. "I know. I don't blame you for what happened with Mom. I need to figure out my own life. I can't be around either of you right now." I didn't argue. There was no point in trying to convince her to stay. Grace had her own path to follow, and it was clear that she couldn't find that path while staying in the wreckage of our broken family. "I'll miss you," I said quietly, feeling a strange sense of loss. "I'll miss you too, Rick," she replied, her voice soft. And with that, she left. I watched as she got into her car and drove away, disappearing down the street and out of my life. I didn't know where she was going or when I'd see her again, but I hoped that she'd find the peace she was looking for. As for Emily, she moved out of the house shortly after the divorce. She packed up what little she had left and moved to a small, isolated town called Red Creek, nestled in the foothills of the Rockies. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, to start over far away from the life they once knew. From what I heard, Emily was living in a tiny cabin on the outskirts of town, working odd jobs just to make ends meet. She had no friends, no family, and no future. It was a fitting end for her. In the weeks after it all ended, I spent a lot of time reflecting on everything that had happened. I'd achieved my revenge. Emily, Mercer, and Brad had all paid the price for their betrayals. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone in the house, I found myself thinking about my past, about the man I used to be. I remembered one night in particular, years ago, during my time in the Navy. It was a mission that had gone sideways. Everything had fallen apart, and my team had been trapped behind enemy lines. We were pinned down, taking heavy fire from all sides, and I knew we wouldn't make it out alive unless I did something drastic. I made the decision to take point, leading my men through a narrow canyon, where we were ambushed by a group of insurgents. I can still remember the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls, the adrenaline pumping through my veins as I returned fire, trying to hold the line while my team retreated to safety. I was hit twice, once in the leg, once in the side, but I didn't stop. I kept going, pushing through the pain until we were out of the canyon and back to our extraction point. It was the kind of situation that could have broken me, but it didn't. I thrived on that kind of pressure, on the thrill of danger. It gave me a sense of purpose, of clarity. I felt that same clarity during these months of revenge, calculating every move, planning every step. The rush of adrenaline as I watched my enemies fall, one by one. It reminded me of the old days, of the man I used to be. But now that it was over, I realized that I was alone again. The adrenaline had faded, and I was left with the quiet emptiness of a life without purpose. I had one, but the victory felt hollow. I didn't miss Emily. I didn't miss any of the people I had destroyed, but I couldn't deny the feeling that something was missing. The excitement, the thrill of the fight, it was gone. For now, though, I was content. I had my house, my charger, and the peace that came from knowing I had exacted my revenge. Life would go on, in its quiet way, and maybe, in time, I'd find something else to give me that sense of purpose again. But for now, I was at peace with what I had done. If you like the story, don't hesitate to subscribe and listen to new stories every day. Write in the comments what you like the most.